This is MetroFocus with Raphael P. Roman, Jack Ford, and Jenna Flanagan.
Good evening and welcome to the MetroFocus Front Page Forecast. I'm Jenna Flanagan. In this week's look ahead at the major headlines, New York rolls out its plan to combat crime on the subways after another troubling weekend on the tracks. At least 8 more violent incidents were reported in stations and on trains just weeks after the shoving death of Michelle Go ignited protests against anti-Asian hate. So, will the new safety plan and its focus on stopping people from sheltering in the system lead to a safer ride? We'll discuss. Also, Governor Kathy Hulkel is also warning New Yorkers to be aware of cyber attacks on their personal accounts amid escalating conflicts in Ukraine. What else could Russia's latest move, recognizing the independence of the 2 rebel-held areas, mean for peace and life back here at home? So for much more on these stories, as well as their take on what else could drive the news this week, let's welcome tonight's roundtable of experts. Now, first, we're welcoming Naila Amaru. She is a Democratic political strategist, an Iraq veteran, and former executive director for the City Council's Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus. Naila, welcome back to MetroFocus.
Thanks for having me.
We'd also like to welcome back Chris Kwok. Chris is a board member of the Asian American Bar Association of New York, as well as a community organizer. Chris, it's great to have you back on the show.
Great to be here.
And we'd like to welcome Nicole Gelinas. Nicole is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, the New York-based think tank, and she's also a contributing editor for City Journal and a New York Post columnist. Nicole, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So first, let's start off with the subway safety plan. And so actually, Nicole, I'm going to start with you and just get your take on what at least this plan is hoping to accomplish.
Well, first of all, people who are feeling afraid on the subway, which according to the MTA surveys is most people, they're not imagining it. We have a serious violent crime spike on the subway. In the month of January, for example, we had 105 violent felonies on the subway. Back in January 2019, we had 65 violent felonies. So we see, even as ridership is low, only about 55 to 60% of the pre-COVID normal, not only is the per capita risk of violent crime higher, but even just the raw numbers of violent crimes are higher. And that's not an aberration the month of January. That this has been continually true for the past 2 years. So what does the Adams and Hulkel subway safety plan do? We saw the mayor and the governor announce this plan last Friday. But they also announced a very similar plan a month before. Very few changes over the past 5 weeks since the first plan was announced. And that's another reminder that it didn't really work for the first month during the month of January. So what is the plan? More civilian mental health outreach teams to interact with homeless and mentally ill people who are living or loitering in the subway, and having civilian responses to 911 calls for distress rather than having the police respond to those calls as the first resort. And the mayor also said he doesn't want to see people smoking in the subway. He doesn't want to see people jumping over the turnstiles, that behavior will no longer be allowed. It's a perfectly sound plan. The question is, how well do they execute it? And when someone doesn't want help in the subway, what happens then? In the past, these outrage teams have just moved on and left the person there to their own devices. Neither the mayor nor the governor has said what happens when that person with all their belongings in the subway just says, no, I don't want any help, and continues going on with the unhealthy behavior.
Of course. Well, Chris, I want to bring you into the conversation. And I do want to also share with viewers that we might lose Chris at the end of our conversation because he does have a heart out. However, Chris, I want to pose this to you and say, in light of the types of crimes that we're seeing and also who they seem to be frequently perpetrated against, what is your take on the plan that's been rolled out? And is it really addressing the correct underlying issues?
The underlying issues are enormous. And it really, I think, began with de Blasio's administration, where he got rid of the homeless unit within the NYPD, came up with teams to address these kind of issues. And I think we still don't know if they've been addressed properly. And I think COVID-19 has put enormous stress on our social network. And I think the violence we're seeing on the subway is a result of just the stress on our homeless population, because it's been stressful for us, right? Normal people work from home. Imagine if you're homeless and you can't get money or services or things like that. And so I think that the plan can't just be cops, throwing people out of the station, because that would be inhumane. But at the same time, the plan is basically an enforcement of the rules you already have on the books, right? People living on the subway, taking up the end of the subway cars or bedroom. We began seeing that as like a norm, right? I saw enormous sort of bags of stuff and people just living in the subway. It wasn't humane for anybody, including the homeless persons, that we saw. And the Asian American community, I tell you, is living in fear. They avoid the subway if they can, take it only when they have to. So we are at a difficult point in our city, and people welcome the plan, but we have to see how much resources are devoted to when people are taken out of the subways. They should have a place to go.
Nyla, I mean, this is, again, an ongoing issue for New York. And as Chris did lay out, the existence of the pandemic has exacerbated problems that have always existed within the city, and especially for the homeless population. But I want to get your take on this plan. And do you see it as being able to address the problem of people being assaulted on the subways? And does something larger need to be done?
Absolutely. So my take on the plan is that it falls significantly short in what it's trying to achieve. Essentially, removing people from end of the life subways does not solve the problem of mental health and homelessness, which is, part of, the situation of what we're seeing now play out. And also the challenge of recognizing that enforcing laws that are on the books now does not address generations of failed government policies, and lack of an adequate social safety net to prevent these types of situations from happening in the first place, particularly when it comes to homelessness and mental health. And I would also add that, one of the key challenges is with enforcing the laws that are on the books, by trying to crack down on what's been happening, it can lead to a criminalizing of people who are already experiencing mental health issues and homelessness. And the enforcement leaves them really with nowhere else to go but jail, which again continues to perpetuate this really unfortunate systems when government again has failed in terms of the providing an adequate social safety net, which leads us again into this really unfortunate cycle that we're seeing here play out. So again, the enforcement on laws that are already on the books, while it may visually clear out on the subways, physically, the quote unquote issues, but it does not at all begin to address the root causes, which again is the need for government investment and programs and resources for our neighbors and fellow New Yorkers who are dealing with mental health and homelessness.
Of course. Nicole, I want to go back to you and just get, just from following everything that's been happening, can you sort of summarize for us the numbers or perhaps the frequency in which a lot of these attacks are happening against members of the Asian American community?
Sure, I think Chris is absolutely right that although this crime is broad, we have groups of every ethnic and other background who has been a victim of violent crime in the subway, that Asian Americans and people of Asian background certainly have particular reason to be fearful. I mean, if we look at the not just the Michelle Go subway murder on January 15th, but also the Christina Yuna Lee murder. Now that murder did not take place in the subway. It took place in her own home in Chinatown. Not clear whether she was targeted for her ethnicity, but we certainly have to consider it as a real possibility. And if you look at the person who is accused at killing Christina Yuna Lee, Asama Nash, he was accused last fall in multiple supposedly low-level subway crimes. So last September, he was allegedly vandalizing MetroCard machines repeatedly. The purpose of doing that was closed so that no one else could buy a MetroCard at the machine, so they would have to buy a swipe from him. He would let the person into the subway. When he encountered someone who didn't want to go along with that, he allegedly punched that person in the head so hard that that person required stitches to his head. Now, of course, Mr. Nash may be suffering from mental illness, but we have to figure out what went wrong in the city here. It's not a lack of resources or attention. He was arrested multiple times last year. He was put on supervised release, in other words, not kept in jail, because the city was supposed to supervise him on this release. So the city had multiple times to interact with this person, to do a mental health evaluation of this person, to make sure that he was getting the care and services that he needed. And if you look at why this individual is homeless, like many, many people in this situation, including the person accused of killing 2 people on the subways a year ago, last February, he's homeless not because of a lack of housing or jobs. He had a home in New Jersey. He was not able to stay in that home because of severe behavioral problems. And so the issue here is the city of New York is not going to give every person who shows up in the subway and presents with mental illness or violent behavior a home. It is stopping the behavior, number one. The city had an opportunity to do that, and making sure that, yes, the person is getting the health and services that they need. But the opportunities are there to do that. Somewhere along the way, the Adams administration, before that, the de Blasio administration, in supervising this individual, failed. And so we need to know those specific points of failures before we can say we need to invest more money in the system.
Well, Chris, and I know that we've had this discussion before, but I really want to get your legal explanation, or at least understanding, as to why crimes like these aren't immediately determined to be hate crimes. Because I'm sure for a lot of people, this feels like obvious hate crimes.
You know, hate crimes are a recent invention in state law, about 4 decades, and they require that someone be selected and then the crime committed because of that person's race, color, or prohibited identity, and the state of mind. And so the law has developed, prosecution has developed to say, okay, first there must be a crime, and then that person must have been selected because of that crime. And primarily in our country, those have been anti-Black and anti-Semitic crime. So we understand the narratives and the symbols and the actions that go around it. You know, the noose for African Americans, a particular historical symbolism. We all understand that because we know that as Americans. Anti-Semitism, the desecration of the synagogues, swastikas, those kind of like speak to it. And in the past years, since we started talking about it, what I've seen for Asians is that there isn't that narrative, and often there are no words that need to be said. People perceive Asians to be carrying large amounts of cash, to be easy targets, not to fight back. For Asian women, there's a sexualization of them within the culture that perceives them to be available, or there should be. And if they're not, there can be sort of like enormous violence that comes out of it. We saw that in Atlanta. So we don't see like traditional definitions of the hate crime as we understand it. But I think that what we see slowly is that there's something different when it comes to Asians. There's an anti-Asian sentiment to it, but it's not happening in the ways that we've traditionally understood hate crimes to be, as I think our assessment at this point.
Of course. Nyla, I'd love to get your take, because as we were hearing Nicole sort of talk about, you know, what at least the proposals are, and, you know, what at least we know about the crimes that have taken place, you know, some people have already criticized things as whack-a-mole, and we've just lost Chris, he did have to go. But some people have been criticizing this as whack-a-mole, and that this was something that, you know, we're never really going to be able to address something unless we address holistically what's going on in the city. So your take.
So I think specifically regarding, you know, the recent spike of anti-Asian hate crimes, I think it's important to recognize that racism against Asian Americans has very long and deep roots in America, right? And the recent spikes in the hate attacks, I would argue, is largely attributable to the political rhetoric surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And that begins with the previous administration that had government officials, introduce racist terms such as China virus and the Wuhan flu, which led to an increased attack, on our Asian neighbors here in New York City. An unfortunate fact was that prior to 2019, there were only 3 attacks against Asian Americans. But after, this racist rhetoric came around, there was a 900% increase of attacks against Asians in 2020. And so I think it's really important to recognize the unfortunate reality that the terms that government officials have used lead to the reality that hate speech leads to hate crimes. And recognizing that there needs to be, again, that recognition of this is unfortunately not new in America. And again, just recognizing the impact that the terms that we use has an impact that can lead to physical violence against our neighbors here in New York City.
Well, again, this is an issue that we will continue to watch as it develops, not only the way that the city attempts to address crime on and around the subways, but how the city continues to address attacks against Asian Americans. But I want to pivot now to the Ukraine, which I think I shouldn't say for a lot of New Yorkers. We have a lot of New Yorkers who are from Russia, from the Ukraine. So this probably feels very close to home for them. But it might surprise people in other parts of New York State that Governor Hulkel has come out and said that we should all be on the lookout for cyber attacks. So Nicole, in a world that's just almost strictly digital for a lot of people, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think we should always be on the lookout for cyber attacks, but certainly there is a heightened risk when you have sanctions being put on Russia and then Russia most likely retaliating against that in some unpredictable fashion that we don't understand. And I think for most people, the rules are just the same, just a heightened attention to it. Don't open emails when you don't know the sender. Don't open attachments when you are not expecting the attachments. Be careful for people who are pretending to be people on social media, trying to get you to make remarks to them and so forth. I think that will persist and be heightened in this environment.
Naila, first of all, I do think that digital security is something that we all should be aware and vigilant about. But the fact that the governor said again that this could be a way for American adversaries to further exacerbate tensions that already exist in the country. Do you think that that might be something that takes place, considering that this seems to right now be between Russia and the Ukraine?
It's absolutely a possibility, right? Particularly here home in New York, when it comes to cyber threats, our own New York City Law Department, had their entire system hacked last summer, as well as I believe the MTA. And so I think particularly with this most recent, conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the impact that it can have here at home, again, is because US and New York has been targeted by cyber threats before. It can also have, a new focus on attacking potential power grids, right? We saw what happened to Texas. Local governments, again, here in New York City, our own law department was targeted and attacked last year. Hospitals could potentially be targets. And so again, with the imposition of sanctions that Biden has promised, I think that America and New York in particular should unfortunately be prepared for an imminent cyber attack if those sanctions are in fact imposed.
To both of you, I do want to ask, because again, there are so many New Yorkers who are either have immigrated directly from Ukraine or Russia or have family members who still live there. I'm wondering how much should Americans be giving this perhaps more of their attention and more of their concern? Because it can feel, because it's practically on the other side of the globe, so very far away. Nicole, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, and there is so much that people have to pay attention to right now. It is perfectly understandable if this is not the top of people's list in trying to make sure that their kids' schools stay open so that they can get back to work, and trying to accustom themselves to getting back into recalibrating the risk of everyday life with COVID. But certainly, as we've learned in the past, thanks not only to external events, but to our responses to those external events, things that happen far away tend not to stay far away.
Naila, same question to you. Should we be paying more attention to the conflict between these two nations?
I think that we should. And I think that the most direct impact, if anything, aside from the cyber attacks, is the potential retaliation for increased energy costs, which people will be definitely feeling in their pocketbooks, as Russia holds, a lot of control when it comes to oil and natural gas industry. And the other thing that I would say in that the argument that we here in New York should definitely be paying more attention, again, is to recognize New York as a state, is that we are a leader in some key industries such as finance, energy, the transportation sectors, which does make New York an attractive target if Russia, should have an interest again in any type of retaliation.
All right. Well, we usually don't have time, but today we do. So I want to get takes from both of you on the stories that you're going to be watching this week as they develop, and what at least is grabbing your attention the most. And so, Nicole, I'll start with you. What is something that's really a storyline that you've been following that you're really looking to see how it develops this week?
Yeah, I think we'll have to really see how Adams's subway plan works in practice. The plan was officially put into place yesterday. I think New Yorkers want to see fast results from this. We've already gone through nearly 2 months of a continuation of the crime situation from the past 2 years. So if you look at the most recent murder statistics through February 10th, murders are actually up slightly over last year. Now, of course, a slight increase in the murder rate would not be a concern, except for the fact that since 2019, the 52% increase in the murder numbers that we've seen in New York City, the single biggest increase over 2 years that the city has ever seen, even going back to the days of much higher crime. We've never seen a year-to-year increase like this. So the immediate hopes of the Adams administration that he could show a quick, clear, decisive turnaround in these numbers, the longer that the numbers persist in staying higher than they were last year, he quickly loses control of that narrative. So looking at the violent crime situation, both underground and above ground, going to be very a big sign of what Adams's first 100-day narrative looks like in just a few weeks away.
Now, the same question to you. What is the storyline that you're going to be watching as it develops this week?
So I am paying attention to the budget dance. The mayor came out with his budget sometime last week. And so just kind of, watching how the council responds, particularly as the mayor has made it clear that he's interested in making across the board cuts in a lot of the key agencies, and interested to see how the council will respond in terms of where the budget will continue to invest, particularly as we are still in the middle of a global pandemic, and how that will impact government programs, resources, and services for fellow New Yorkers. And the other thing that I'm paying attention to is the kerfuffle between the press and the mayor administration, and just keeping an eye on how the mayor chooses to manage his relationship with the press. It's no secret there's always a history of tension between the press corps and New York City mayors, including former Mayor Bill de Blasio, but just really interested in watching how Eric Adams moves forward in walking that tightrope of managing the press.
Well, of course, that already has proven to be an interesting relationship. Nicole, going back to you very quickly, though, because one of the things that caught my attention when you were talking about the crime rate is how much do you see I know that a lot of politicians keep saying that we're going to start moving past the pandemic, but that doesn't seem to be the case in people's everyday lives. The virus is continuing to circulate, et cetera. So how much do you see COVID-19 affecting those crime numbers, or do you think that they are affecting them at all?
Well, I think what affected how COVID affected the crime numbers was not what might be the intuitive thinking that people lost their jobs, they lost their income, and they were forced for economic reasons to go out and commit crimes to feed their families. What we are seeing is that people who were already disconnected from society, people who were already suffering from mental illness, people who were already involved in the criminal world, the pullback of the city's social work efforts, the pullback in supervision, the pullback in policing last year, this allowed this activity to take hold and then to start to spiral out of control. You know, for example, if you have one shooting, one shooting begets another shooting and begets another shooting, because we have multiple retaliatory shootings if the police are not able to make an arrest after that first shooting and hopefully prevent the first shooting in the first place.
Nicole,
but we
I'm so sorry. We do have to leave it there. We've run out of time very quickly, but I do want to thank all of my guests. Chris Kwok, who did have to leave us, board member of the Asian American Bar Association of New York; Naila Amaru, a Democratic political strategist and former director for the city's Council on Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus; and our newest roundtable member, Nicole Gelinas, senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, the New York-based think tank, and of course, contributing editor for City Journal and New York Post columnist. Thank you all so much for joining us on today's roundtable.